Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters on France 24. I'm Nadia Massi. Here's what's coming up. A prisoner swap in Yemen boosts hopes of establishing a lasting peace. Hundreds released by both Saudi Arabia and Houthi rebels. As optimism grows of a breakthrough in Yemen, we examine the role the Saudi-Iran deal is having on the balance of power in the region. And less than a month before Turkey's election, we ask, will survivors of February's earthquake be able to vote? First then to Yemen, where over 900 prisoners have been released this past week as momentum builds towards ending the 9-year conflict there. Several flights brought prisoners from Saudi Arabia to the Yemeni capital Sana'a, which is held by Houthi rebels, while others were flown to the government-controlled city of Aden in the south of Yemen. With more on those prisoner swaps and why they're bolstering hopes of a permanent ceasefire, here's Olivia Salazar-Winspear.
A euphoric atmosphere on the plane headed to Sana'a, Yemen's Houthi-held capital, as these former prisoners rejoice at the idea of reuniting with their families after years spent abroad behind bars.
It's the most beautiful day of our lives because we are free and now we are safely heading to our country under the protection of the Red Cross.
Hundreds of Houthi rebel prisoners flew to Sana'a from Saudi Arabia on Saturday. A flight in the other direction to Riyadh from Sana'a also took 20 former detainees, including Saudi and Sudanese men. It was all part of an organised exchange of some 900 prisoners, coordinated by the Red Cross.
It's a special moment, and I think that to have all actors willing to have this release during Ramadan, having the detainees who have been separated from their family for years to join again, it's more than just a release. It's a release during Ramadan and with it inside. So it's a powerful sign.
The people of Yemen have endured 8 years of a proxy war carried out between the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, who seized the north of the country after a coup in 2014, and the government, which controls the south, backed by Saudi Arabia. The conflicts left millions on the brink of famine and 2/3 of the population relying on humanitarian aid. Last month there was a breakthrough, though, when talks in Beijing led to diplomatic ties being restored between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Last week, a Saudi delegation visited rebel-held Sana'a and promised more talks were on the horizon. Each side says a lasting truce is still far away, yet this prisoner swap is a major step closer to the end of the war.
Well, as we heard at the end of that report, the renewed optimism in Yemen is linked to the fact that the leadership in Saudi Arabia and in Iran are talking to each other again. The two powerful countries broke off relations 7 years ago, impacting politics and conflict across the region, from Lebanon to Syria, Iraq, and of course to Yemen. Well, now that diplomatic ties have been restored in a deal brokered by the Chinese government, what might change? To discuss, I'm very pleased to be joined now by Julien Barnes-Dacey. He's the Middle East Programme Director at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to you, sir.
Hello.
Let's start then with Yemen. Given this Iran-Saudi deal, do you think the end of the conflict in Yemen might now finally be in sight?
Well, I think it's a positive step, obviously. I mean, both Saudi Arabia and Iran have been using Yemen as a proxy theatre to fight each other. So the fact that they are now looking to de-escalate their regional conflict and looking to press the parties in Yemen towards a settlement is a very positive step. But I think we also have to be honest. The Saudi motivation here is to get out of the conflict and to stop missiles flying into Saudi Arabia. It's not necessarily focused on resolving the internal dynamics of the intra-Yemeni conflict. At the same time, the Iranians have some influence over the Houthis, but they are not the puppet masters here. And so the question of whether this regional rapprochement can translate into a meaningful, inclusive settlement between the warring Yemeni parties is still something that remains to be seen and will require a lot of work going forward. This is step one. It's a positive first step. But it really requires support now for an inclusive Yemeni track to take things forward.
And you sort of alluded to some of the reasons why Saudi Arabia may be looking for a deal now. Do you think that if a deal is found, this is an admission of defeat for Saudi Arabia because it has failed, hasn't it, to drive those Houthi rebels out of the capital despite years of fighting?
Absolutely. I mean, the Riyadh is now talking to a movement that it vowed not to talk to, that it wanted to be defeated and pushed out of Yemen. They're talking to the Houthis about an end to missiles and effectively a peace between the Houthi movement and Saudi Arabia. They're not talking to the Houthis so much about the internal governance question, it would seem, although that may come to bear as we move forward. So this is a defeat for the Saudis. It's not what they wanted from Yemen, but the priority for Riyadh now is to get out, to ensure some stability on their southern border, and to be able to focus all their efforts and resources on this Vision 2030 economic kind of renewal that the Crown Prince MBS is driving at home.
Yemen, though, isn't the only country in the Middle East where we can see a sort of regional balance of power shifting right now. If we look at Syria, there are clearly efforts there to end the isolation of the dictator Bashar al-Assad. The Saudi foreign minister is visiting Damascus this week. That's the first time in a decade. And there are efforts as well to welcome Syria back into the Arab League. How much do you think these efforts to rehabilitate Assad are being led by Saudi Arabia, and how significant do you think that all is?
Well, I mean, it speaks to a number of things. I mean, one, it's just Saudi Arabia, like many other regional states, and exemplified by talks with Iran, wanting an end to regional conflict and regional instability, and recognizing that Assad is not going anywhere. He's there to stay, and that they're going to have to deal with him. So it's part and parcel of this bigger picture regional détente, of which the Iran-Saudi talks is one of them. Will it change much? I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, the Saudis are hoping that they can extract some concessions out of Assad on regional files. They're hoping that it might lead to some dilution of Iranian influence. But Assad has never given an inch. He has very little kind of willingness to compromise at this stage, or seeming imperative to do so, given that the people are coming back to him. So it's a pretty kind of depressing prognosis for Syrians who are suffering under a broken state, economic collapse, and who see Arab states focused on effectively dealing with the Captagon trade, with external flows of refugees, rather than internal stability, economic revival, political security questions.
And what about for Israel? Because there are some who believe that this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran leaves Israel more vulnerable, perhaps less likely to secure its own sort of normalization deal with Israel. Do you agree? Do you think Israel's now more isolated as a result of this realignment?
I think it makes it harder for the Israelis to construct this anti-Iranian alliance that they were hoping to do so. They brought in a number of states, and they very much see Saudi Arabia as being a linchpin of this. Riyadh may still be willing to move forward with some degree of engagement with Israel and normalization, but it's not going to do so, I think, under the desired Israeli umbrella of forging an anti-Iran coalition. Saudi Arabia wants regional stability. It recognizes that it has to talk to Iran to guarantee its own security interests. It may want to talk to Israel for interests related to the economy, to relations to the US. But it does leave, I think, Israel in a trickier position if its goal was to mount a regional campaign against Iran in terms of isolating it and potentially even launching military strikes against its nuclear facilities. That's not something it's going to be able to do quite so easily any longer for a number of political reasons, but even logistical reasons in terms of overflight needs and in terms of using Saudi airspace to potentially strike Iran.
And just a final thought. I mean, the Iran-Saudi deal, with all of its kind of complex implications that you've talked about, was orchestrated by the Chinese government. It apparently took the Americans by surprise. Is that a sign that the United States is retreating diplomatically in the Middle East, and that indeed China is now trying to fill that vacuum?
I think it's clear that the Americans want to do less in the Middle East. There's no getting around that. The Biden administration is focused on Ukraine, it's focused on Asia. It doesn't want to get sucked into regional engagement and conflict in the same extent of past administrations. So clearly they're doing less. This has resulted in regional actors stepping up and doing more themselves, and it's also less space for like Chinese to maneuver in and create openings. But look, I think it's also one should be wary in terms of framing this as a kind of US-China competition dynamic. Regional stability, regional talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia is good for the region, it's good for China, it's good for the West. If the region isn't fighting each other, there's stability, it secures energy security. I mean, it plays out to a lot of mutual benefit. So I think you've seen the Biden administration welcoming, in a sense, this move. There's some criticism in Washington that the Chinese are stepping up, but the Americans seem to be happy to let this happen if it guarantees or moves forward some US interests while allowing them to focus elsewhere globally.
Julien Barnes-Dacey, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Next, we're heading to Turkey, where the campaign for next month's election is in full swing. For incumbent President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, it is arguably the biggest test of his political career as the country reels from a devastating earthquake. And now there are fears that hundreds of thousands of people from areas impacted by the quake won't be able to cast their ballots. Monty Francis explains.
When two massive earthquakes rocked Turkey back in February, some 3 million Turks were forced to leave the disaster zone and head elsewhere. Here at this refugee shelter near Ankara, hundreds of families are rebuilding their lives. And with so much already on their minds, many missed a deadline on April 2nd to report a change of address, meaning they would have to return to their previous municipality to vote in the upcoming presidential election.
We don't want to lose any rights. That's why we want to go back to vote. Some of us have settled our families in a safe place. We're going back to vote. We will protect our rights.
But with their homes in ruins and resources at a minimum, for most, going back to cast a ballot is not an option.
This should have been organised by the state. The ballot boxes should have been brought here instead of forcing people to go back. I mean, I'm sorry to say this, but how can you vote in the earthquake zone among the corpses? How can you force people to vote under those circumstances?
The earthquakes have given rise to anger against the Turkish government, primarily for a failure to enforce building codes. The current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has taken the brunt of that anger and is now in a tough race with opposition candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, whose coalition accuses the president of using the requirement to deprive earthquake victims of their vote.
It was very simple. Everyone's voter registry transfer period could have been extended, but Erdogan's party thinks that earthquake victims are angry with them. They won't vote for us anyway. The more difficult we make it, the better. This is their logic.
Erdogan's party denies any such motivation as he faces his strongest challenge yet during his 2 decades in power. Most polls show Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu with a slight edge in the race.
And that's the end of Middle East Matters this week. Thanks for watching, and do stay with us. Much more still to come here on France 24.
Siempre. Me gusta Francia 24 horas porque nos enteramos de las noticias de Europa, de América Latina y de todos lados. Nos gusta mucho la cultura francesa.
The world is ever changing. The news doesn't wait. That's why at France 24, we'll always be there to help make sense of world events. For the best international coverage, 24 hours a day, no matter what, France 24 is with you everywhere, all the time.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.